Hello, everyone, and welcome to Celebrating Cinema, a podcast for the love of cinema. I'm your host, Laura Romans. Do you love what we do? Support us by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us get found by fellow cinema lovers. And also, make sure to get your tickets to our next film club, which will be a screening of the cult classic Juice on January 30th, starring Tupac Shakur. We're bringing this film back to the big screen to coincide with a conversation that we had with the iconic director Ernest Dickerson, who you might know from his work with Spike Lee as a cinematographer. The link for the tickets is in the show notes. Before we jump into the conversation with Raoul Peck, I caught up with our producer Elliot to find out a little bit more about Raoul Peck and what we can expect to hear from this conversation.
My name is Ernest Cole. I was born March 21st, 1940, in Pretoria, South Africa. In the 60s, every day, every hour, despite the dangers, I photographed apartheid without stopping.
So you had a really cool conversation with Raoul Peck?
Yeah, I have to say I was a bit of a fanboy at this moment because Raoul Peck is a bit of a legend for me. For those that don't know, he's a Haitian filmmaker, and I've always been obsessed with how cinema can impact society and how cinema is always political, and I think he embodies this perfectly. His films have sort of been a way of rewriting history and correcting history. Often what he does is he'll go back to historical moments and give a voice to the people who actually lived it rather than the people who have perhaps observed it or written from the history books. And it's very powerful. You can watch any of his films and you'll be moved by it. What he does really well is sort of he connects all the histories of oppressed people in the sense that he sort of traces sort of European colonialism but links it with genocide from its own past of the Holocaust. And if you look at documentary series like Exterminate the Brutes, that's something he does really well. But then he also expands further with sort of colonialism of Africa and also Haiti. He's a very clever guy. When I say he connects all these histories of oppressed people, he's also done a film on Marx. He's sort of connecting communism, which perhaps is a dirty word for some people, but he does it quite well. And then his next project is going to be about George Orwell and sort of the 1984 reality that we are actually living in. But yeah, it coincides with Ernest Cole, Lost and Found, which is also another forgotten history. It's about this photographer from South Africa. And what he would do, he would document the apartheid that was happening in South Africa. And while retrospectively we look at it as sort of this very obvious crime that was happening to the people of South Africa, at the time, nobody was listening to them. And no photos were being allowed out of South Africa of what was really going on. And Ernest Cole's nephew came to Raoul Peck with this story because Ernest Cole himself, he had to leave to America and he had a really hard time in America. He was in poverty and he suffered a lot of hardships, wasn't taken too seriously for his work. He was sort of pigeonholed for just being a photographer of apartheid. And so they just wanted him to photograph other black oppressed people. And basically his entire collection got lost for many, many years. And then it somehow ended up in a Swedish vault.
Wow.
Yeah, in a Swedish bank.
So that all got uncovered.
Yeah, and the Swedish bank won't tell the family how they came.
How it ended up there.
Yeah, which is really cool. Other films I would like to highlight on his, in the program that we're playing is Lumumba, which is about Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, who was assassinated. It's a really incredible watch. And also I Am Not Your Negro, which people may not know, but so it's about James Baldwin. And again, it traces James Baldwin's life where he flees America because this was during the 60s with the whole civil rights movement, but he didn't feel safe or belonged in America. And the tragic irony is that Ernest Cole leaves South Africa to go to America at the same time. And so he sort of threads all these things really nicely. And yeah, you'll hear from the conversation, passionate he is about everything, how clever he is about everything. I only wish I had more time because he sort of goes on to sort of connect everything with what's happening in the world right now. So we didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about film and Ernest Cole, but I think people will really love it.
I can't wait to hear more. Let's dive into the conversation with Raoul Peck.
Hi, Raoul. Firstly, I want to say it really is an honor to speak with you. I've always believed that cinema is political and that it can be a great tool for social change. And I think your films demonstrate that and sort of shed a path on how that can be achieved. We always like to ask our guests by asking them their first memory of cinema, perhaps a formative memory for you.
Whoa, that's if we can take in account my age, that send me way back. in the past. I think I've told that story a long time before, but it's probably, in Haiti, before I left, my parents left Haiti. Haiti was a country where cinema was really important. There was at least two or three big cinemas in every big and middle and small cities in Haiti, throughout Haiti. At the time, for a population of maybe 5 to 6 million, you had almost 1 million spectators a year.
Wow.
And I remember going, in Port-au-Prince to a drive-in cine, which was also, there were at least 4 or 5 in Port-au-Prince alone. And so for kids, it was great because you could go in your pajamas and lay asleep anytime you go. You could, if the film was of no interest for you, you could play with the other children's with the cars and go get popcorns, etc. So, and the people who were poor could still watch the film on the walls that was circling the cinema. So it was quite a cultural phenomena at the time. So those are my first memories, and also I remember seeing it was probably a sort of Jerry Lewis type of film,
Yeah.
slapstick, where I remember vividly like a piano shutting down on somebody's hands and then heads, and then the heads would come out of the piano. But for me, that was like watching an horror movie, because I couldn't at the time, understand the difference, that it was, it was a trick. It's that the head was not really cut,
Yeah.
and that the finger were not really hurt, etc. So that's, I think, my probably traumatic first impression of cinema.
I can imagine. I mean, already you sort of mentioned how cinema is sort of part of Haiti and therefore yourself, but you also went on to live many different lives before ending up as a filmmaker. Could you perhaps share what it was that led you to becoming a filmmaker and deciding this is the medium for you? Because I think, if I'm right from reading, you realized it was the best way for you to express your politics or to deal with politics and society.
Well, you can imagine when we look at the role that images, videos, films today have in our lives. You can imagine the impact that it has, whether it's in disinformation, or even making the level of ignorance even greater, despite the incredible range and impact that it should have in terms of culture and knowledge. So for me, I grew up, using cameras, and my father, had cameras, photo cameras. Later on, he had a Super 8, etc. So it was part of what we would call at the time a hobby. It's making images, making building souvenirs, etc. So it was always something that we had in the house. I never imagined it as a possible profession. But when when I went to study in Berlin, it became a more central activity for me. I became a sort of sideline photographer while I was studying. I was studying economy and engineering. But the cultural life in Berlin was very intense. Everybody I knew was involved in some sort of cultural, artistic activity beside the political activities. So all that was mixed in a very organic way. At the time, the youth of the time, anybody between 16 and 30 was involved in politics. It was a generation where you could not be involved. In Berlin itself, most liberation movement were based at their antenna Germany itself was, going under a lot of pressure following, the 68 years, the 1968 riots everywhere in the world, student revolt everywhere in the world. So we were still in that era. And so being involved in politics was just something that it was at the time being an influencer, like today, in regard to today, So when I came more and more into cinema, the angle was clearly political. There was no other option, and coming from the third world, I was still, from a country that was still under dictatorship.
Mm.
So the question for us or people like me was, do you go back and fight? And the answer was, 95% of us is to go back and fight and get killed.
Mm.
That was the option. So until I was in my 30s, that there was no other viable, respectful, or natural choice. So when I became more and more involved through the different activities that I was involved in, cinema became like the tool and the receptacle that, can you say that? Receptacle? Receptacle, French. That included everything that I like, images, stories, politics, music. And that's how I learn. That's how I watch films. That's how I then ultimately made film.
One of the things that I find most striking about your work is that you're not only rewriting history, but you're correcting history and you're giving a voice to those that have been oppressed and allowing them to tell their stories for the first time. I'm sure you're familiar with Edward Said, the post-colonial scholar.
Yes.
He once spoke about how we once needed permission to tell our own history. And I think a lot of your films actually work to create a space where people are able to tell their own stories for the first time. And I wonder what you thought about that.
Well, it's something that luckily I learned very early on, is that history, the way it has been used, the way it has been told, has nothing to do with the reality and the reality of our countries or basically the majority of the world.
Yeah.
Story that, as we knew it, was, in majority very Eurocentric. And you can imagine what lecture it can be of the world. So it took many decades to start, uncover that, even for some to even dare confront that.
Mm.
And so I was lucky to grow up in a time where that was challenged, and I learned quick that I never had to ask permission to tell my own story, because the existing one had put me aside, had basically kept me outside of history, even though we made history, especially coming from Haiti, which is the first Black republic in the American hemisphere, the first republic to have stopped slavery and create a new nation. We were in the middle of history, and that history has been repressed. That's one of the book of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, Silencing the Past. That's exactly what happened. They silenced the past.
And we should talk about Ernest Cole, Lost and Found, someone who was able to keep his own history alive of South Africa with the documentation of apartheid in South Africa. I first wanted to know, I believe the nephew came to you with the story, but what was it exactly about the story that made you think this needed to be a film? Because we spoke earlier about moving images. Using still images can often be a hard thing to do within cinema.
Yeah. Well, several things about your question. I've been asked a lot those last 10 years with a lot of incredible stories, subject, personalities, and of course, I have obviously to make choices, because, do everything, and each film is extremely heavy on research, heavy on work, etc. So, and I would hope that much more filmmakers would see that as also an obligation. there are several ways you can take cinema. Yes, it's entertainment and it's fun and it's great to work with actors or to discover stories. But there is a sense of responsibility as well. I come from a continent or a country or continent, if I talk about the whole third world, where we all have a gun with 5, 6 shots, and we are obliged to make sure that each shot counts. And so that goes the same for the choice of my subject. I have to think hard to make sure, because before I get myself involved in, will the project carry enough weight to make a difference? Will I be able to give all the different important, necessary, impactful layers that the story needs to convey? Talking about Ernest Cole, I probably would not have made the film. It was just about Ernest and his work. It only makes sense for me if it's Ernest Cole in his generation, in his history, the history of his country, the struggle of that country, the necessity to show another aspect and possibly the most important aspect of the fight against apartheid. Although that is part of a sort of reconstitution of truth, reconstitution of history, to set the record straight, to even ask for some humbleness from the side of those who have reigned above the world, maybe some self-critique from politicians who are still carrying the same discourse in other forms and in other places, but it's still the same fight. It's still a fight for a better democracy and equality and share of riches and fight against inequality. So those are unfortunately still the goals that we are trying to achieve. So Ernest Cole became the perfect film for that. And through him, I was also able to tell the story of a whole generation, and even the people in exile who most of the time are always forgotten.
Yeah, I actually found it quite maybe surprising is the wrong word, but how there were so many other South Africans who sought refuge in America and also were very mentally troubled. Like it felt to me that Ernest's biggest fight, despite the poverty he was enduring and the hardships, was with himself and this feeling of being stateless and having your homeland severed from you. But then the fact that he met these other South Africans along the way in America, and still they weren't able to really talk or find the words to share what they were both going through at the same time.
Yeah, well, especially in the time we live in, where people being displaced from their birthland, from their history, from everything they are, not only because of climate change, but also, of course, from wars, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's the north of Israel, whether all those conflicts, all those damage issues is creating exile. And exile is not something that you go into with some sort of relief and happiness. No, you're how do you say, you are living or fleeing a place that has become a total hell for you, for your family, for everybody you love. So the new place where you settle, if you can even settle, if you're accepted, if you're not treated as a criminal or as whatever they are, Donald Trump have been calling people trying to find a better life. It's isolation. Every generation of immigrant in any country have gone through that process of isolation, or is it either assimilation or is it integration? Is it it's a tough moment. And for the South African at the time, don't forget, the apartheid regime was a prison. Even to leave, you couldn't leave like, just ask a visa. Ernest Cole have used a subterfuge to leave. Invented a so-called pilgrim to Lourdes in France. And he has to change even his ID to fake that he was a colored man and not just a black man. So leaving is a first hurdle, and then finding a home. And there were not many South Africans. There were not many foreigners in the U.S. or in a place like New York. They were mostly students, some artists, some journalists, but that's it. And so it was important in the film to show that it's not the free world like it was sold. It's a heart-wrenching situation where the world you left behind is still in your mind every day. It's not some faraway, distant land where, okay, it's past, you don't have to worry about. No, everything makes sure that you have to worry about it every day.
I think it's really important that you mentioned Gaza and Palestine there, because I think what this film also does is, by going back to the history of South Africa and apartheid, helping us understand better present day, as you were mentioning, with everything that's going on in the world, but specifically Palestine and what it really is like to live in an apartheid state. I think if we have any chance of sort of building a better future, what you do with your films is really trying to understand history, which enables us to better understand our present day.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that probably one of the last thing that really angers me, and whether, even though I'm a very peaceful person, and is the ignorance. Now people are throwing ignorance on your face, as you are the one who doesn't know, when you have all your life made your homework to understand, learn, and history. And even in such an horrendous massacre by the Hamas, how horrendous it is. And nobody on the planet accepts that, except, of course, a few crazy people, or, people that are totally, out of their somehow have been drawn out of that reality. It's clear, but you can't use that massacre to eradicate more than 40,000 people. What world is this? No massacre can justify another massacre. And nobody can do as if the history of Palestine and Israel start in 2024 or 2023. It didn't even start in 1948.
No.
And it's still, that was a good reason why I put the whole boycott story in about the apartheid. You show how, whether or not the UN vote against or for sanctions, there are, for some country it's respected, and from other countries those sanctions are not respected. Alone the UN sanction against Israel, which is basically occupying another country, were never respected. On the contrary. So, of course, if nothing sticks, or if nothing is respected, and if people feel that they are not being heard, that legal means don't give, result. Like, by the example in the film, when Mandela said, we have exhausted all legal means to stop this craziness. So what else does he have to do? Just lay down and die? So he preferred, they had to come to armed resistance. And that's what happened everywhere to topple the colonization, because all legal means were closed. Even the people who succeeded in making peace, like Rabin, was killed in his own country, a man of peace. So, and then you erase all this as nothing that happened before has a price or means something. People have died in both sides to make peace. I could go on and on, but to finish that thematic is, the creation itself of Israel was a copying of the Western powers at the time. They didn't want to have a Jewish problem in their hands. They couldn't fathom the Shoah, the elimination of more than 6 million Jews, communists, gypsies, black people, people who had physical problems in Germany and Eastern Europe. That's the price they didn't want to watch. So giving peace of Palestine to this survivors community, that was the easy thing for them. And then let them deal with it. And they never went back to question that very original mistake that they did.
You draw on it here, and again, sort of with your docu-series Exterminate the Brutes, you also create this line of how Europeans' genocidal history has never been confronted by themselves, and what happened with the Nazis and the Holocaust in Germany, they wanted to export it away from them, because when it happens in their own lands, they can't hide from it. And I think you try to create this connect, or not try, but you succeed in creating this connection of how all genocides around the world are very much linked and rooted very much in a very Eurocentric view.
Yeah, and imperialism and racism, it's one history. We don't have it's one planet. We don't have separated history. It's like the first men and women, they left Africa and populated the rest of the planet.
Yeah.
So where are you going to cut and say, oh yeah, from here on, we're going to cut everything before we are creating a new nation or a new civilization? That's totally, utterly bullshit. It's like the European always, they say, well, beginning of Europe is Greek and Roma. No, Greece and Rome were looking at the Egyptian. How come you cut that part?
Yeah.
And the same, the Americans did the same. It's a new world. But who populated that new world? First of all, you got rid of 100 million of people that were living there, and you pretend you discovered them. And then later you pretend that you bring civilization to them after you've killed most of them. And then you are creating a new world when everybody came from either Europe or Africa. That's the new world you created. But it's not a new world. It's the continuation of a history. Then each time you try to postulate, to cut history in little pieces, because only by cutting it in little pieces, you can lie. You make it incomprehensible for people, where it's a sample story. Tell the whole story so people can understand and can know where they come from and what product of history they are. Because we all share whatever, or we are culprit or we are assassins. We need to know the whole pieces of the puzzle. Otherwise, it's really hard to create a world where we will all have our place.
I think, again, it's very important that you speak of one history and one civilization, because, again, you do that in your work, because while often your focus is on Black history, so from Haiti to Black America to Africa, I think both with Young Marx, and actually I was very excited to see that you're now doing a project on George Orwell, is this idea that it's actually more based on class and the oppression of certain classes, where racism is obviously used as a certain tool to exaggerate that. I think the fact that you're now focusing on a project of George Orwell highlights perhaps the urgency of how much of what Orwell was writing at the time. I mean, I recently just reread Animal Farm again, and there already he's speaking of misinformation and also social amnesia, this idea that we forget. We live in this constant state of the present, that, and without remembering the past, we're able to be sort of dominated by an authoritarian regime.
If you reread 1984 or you watch any of the 5 existing versions of the film 1984, it's a description of the Republican Party becoming the MAGA party. It's exactly that. all the decisions, all the structural changes. It's exactly that. It's so yes, people like Orwell, people like Baldwin, people like Marx were right in analyzing the development of specifically the capitalistic society.
And I just want to bring it back with one final question so we can end on Ernest Cole. I think what surprised me the most about his work is that while he's documenting what is happening to his people, they're actually very visually striking photos. Without the context, they're incredible photos. They're very raw, they're very poetic. And I wondered what you felt the first time you came across his photos.
Well, the first time it was in a political context, so we used these photos, for the anti-apartheid fight. But later on, and especially while making this film, I really understood what he meant by saying, well, I'm photographing the human condition. And also I was able to understand what he meant. I'm a photographer. I'm not a black photographer. The same thing Baldwin says as well. I don't let anybody define who I am. I am first and foremost a human being. And colors and doesn't determine. There, as a black man, there are black people. Haiti had a black dictatorship for more than 35 years. He was one of the ruthless murder. So I can't, embrace him because he's black. That doesn't make sense. So we define ourselves first and foremost as human being, and as such, we have human in front of us, and then we can decide is the person somebody that can be my friend or not. But everything that societies make to divide us, doesn't really make sense, and that I could see in Ernest Cole's work, when the human condition dimension was key for him. And whether he was in the US, in New York, in the South, in South Africa, that was what his eyes was looking for. What is his objective catching? What does it say about us, human being, whatever the context of the society we are living in?
His photos from America, you see him sort of searching for love and for hope with sort of these mixed race couples. But yeah, thank you, Raoul. We always end our conversation by asking our guests what their hopes are for the future. A very broad question and a very difficult one in such times, but I think always good to end on such a note.
Well, that's the worst question to ask with what is happening in the world the last 2-3 years, and what is now going to be a very complicated and complex year. But again, my response, because I'm being asked a lot of time after Q&A, what is, are you optimist, pessimist? I said, I come from a world where asking the question is a luxury. We don't have time to think about that. We just have to continue to fight. And I do hope, especially people in the Western world, Europe in particular, in America, will see that they still hold keys for a better future. But if they all remain bare spectators or consumers, like we have definited again, that's a Marx sentences saying that in capitalism, human beings have become perfect consumers, and everything is within that consume act, even friendship, even love is included in consumption have become a consumption good. So if we continue to perpetrate that sentiment that, well, I can do nothing and, it will be what it will be. Yes, the world will be what each one of us let it happen. There is no magic in that.
Yeah.
If you don't act, something will just happen without, your action or not. So the question doesn't, the hope for me is it's something that, it's something maybe personal, but as a society, as a group of people, whatever we don't do will create something or not.
And I think, Raoul, your films are living proof of that. You've acted when we could have been passive in allowing our history to be told by other people. And I think it exemplifies that very much. So I hope people find hope within your films, because I certainly do. It was a pleasure speaking to you. And I hope not only will people go and watch Ernest Cole, but like I said, we're doing a retrospective of your work. Lumumba will be showing on the 17th of January as well, which coincides with the day he was assassinated. So yeah, thank you. It was really an honor.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your interest. Yeah, bye. Bye-bye.
You can find the link for tickets to Ernest Cole Lost and Found and the Raoul Peck retrospective in the show notes. Next week, we have a conversation with another legendary filmmaker, Ernest Dickerson, so make sure to check back for that. And stay connected with us at Celebrating Cinema and Lab by following @Lab111 on Instagram and Letterboxd. Do you love what we do? Support us by leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us get found by other cinema lovers. And don't forget to check the show notes for all the films mentioned and some bonus info and ticket links. This was a Lab 111 production, edited and produced by Elliot Bloom, with music from Hugo Emertzal and artwork from Studio FFF.